Well, I was going to start my time by asking how you all are doing, but I was sitting here for the last 20 minutes or so, and I feel like I get a good sense of how you all are doing. I feel like you're feeling good. Yeah? Did I read the room right? I feel like it's been a really good week. I feel like God has been moving. I feel like there have been some things stirred up within you. I haven't been here all week. I just got here to campus like an hour ago. But I could sense that the Holy Spirit has been moving, and there's been some good soil here. I think that God's been doing something good. And I was going to ask, well, have you guys made some good memories? But again, just by watching, I can tell you all have made some really good memories here this week. Can I get an amen and applause? Like, can you confirm to me what I already knew was true? All right, so these good memories are important. And I really hope that you can look back on what happened this week for years and years. Like when you're an adult, when you're in your 30s and your 40s, I hope that you can look back on this week at camp and think of it fondly. Like remember what God did during this week. Memories are important. Good memories especially can keep you going when times get tough. Some of my earliest childhood memories involve fishing. Anybody like to go fishing? A few people? All right. I feel you for the ones who don't. I'll tell you a story behind that. Okay, so I don't actually remember this particular moment, but it's a memory because my brother has told me the story so many times. Once when I was just a cute, innocent little toddler, I went fishing with my brother and my dad. And I was standing behind my dad when my dad took his rod and he cast it back. You can guess what happened, right? He cast it back and the hook caught my ear. And before my dad knew what had happened, he threw the line out and the hook ripped right through my ear. And I stood there not even crying. I'm just kidding. I probably cried my head off. My brother actually told me I was standing there screaming for the longest time. And my dad felt horrible because he didn't realize what he had done. But this was, even though I don't really remember it, this was sort of a traumatic experience for me. And I associated that with fishing. Maybe that's why I never really got to like fishing as much as my brother does. I also remember another time when the three of us, my brother, my dad, and I, we went out fishing on a tiny boat. And while we were on the boat, my dad felt a tug, and so he starts reeling in the fish. And my dad, what we thought was a fish, actually pulls up a shark. Okay? Now it's confusing because it's actually called a dogfish, but it's not a dog and it's not a fish, it's a shark. Okay? It's technically a shark and it's got the face of a shark. So here we are in this tiny little boat and my dad's reeling the fish in and I'm expecting him to pull in like a little sunfish or a little trout maybe. And then my dad pulls up a doggone dogfish. But remember, it's not a dog, it's not a fish, it's a shark. And I jumped up and I tried to get away from that thing as fast as I could. But remember, we're in this tiny little boat and there wasn't much place to go. So in my mind, I'm like, I know how to swim. I think I'm going to jump into this water. But then I realized that's where the shark came from. So I'm not going to jump into the water. So I was stuck. I was panicking. I was screaming. I was crying. I was telling my dad, get that thing out of the boat. And he did. He finally threw it back in the water. But not before my brother had the time of his life making fun of me because I was in so much horror. So I was a little bit traumatized by that. That and the hook through my ear, plus the fact that I don't think I was ever patient enough to think that fishing was fun. I think that's why I never really thought of fishing as something that you should choose to do for fun. Like, I get it if people have to fish because they got to eat or it's their way of making a living. But I was like, who goes fishing for fun? To me, it was boring. And maybe I never thought fishing was fun because I was never very good at it either. Like my brother, from an early age, he wanted to learn all the intricacies of fishing. Like what kind of bait is the best kind of bait for a certain type of fish? What kind of rod and reel is good for this type of water? My brother was really into it and he was good at it. You know, even when my brother was just a college student, so just a few years older than some of you, my brother on his own and with another buddy of his who was obsessed with fishing as much as he was, they would get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to go fishing. They would go drive 2 hours to this secret spot that was really good for catching steelhead salmon. So he'd be out there at the crack of dawn because it was the best time to catch this type of salmon. So for my brother, fishing is fun. So fun that he'd sacrifice sleep for it. But if you've ever been fishing, you know that when you're out there on the water or in the water, my brother loved fly fishing too. So if you're in the water or on the water, a good majority of your time is spent just waiting. And sure, you get a rush, you get some adrenaline when you feel a little tug and you start reeling something in, even if it's a shark, right? But a lot of the time, to me at least, it just felt boring. You do a lot of waiting around. But when my brother would go out to fish, I'd usually be able to tell the night before because he had this excited energy about him. The night before, he'd be preparing his bait. Like he even took the salmon roe and he'd make his own bait. He'd cure it with borax and salt and sugar. It's this whole thing. And he'd have all this excited energy around it. And I could tell he was about to go fishing the next morning because he had this excited energy. But I remember there was a period of time in my brother's life when I could tell that things weren't so good. You know, there was something that was going on in his life that even his favorite and only sibling couldn't get him to talk about. He said that when he went fishing, it's like he felt like he could connect with God. He felt like when he was out on the water, there was a unique stillness in nature. There was quiet around him, and he felt like he could connect with God out on the water in ways that he couldn't in the hustle and bustle of the city. So my brother, he loved fishing even when it wasn't for fun. He'd go out to the water and he'd go fishing because that's where he connected with God. I wonder if that's what Peter, one of Jesus' closest disciples, a fisherman by trade, felt like. If fishing is what Peter knew, it's what he was good at. Maybe he didn't necessarily do it for fun because it was his trade, but it ran in the family. This is what they do. They were a family of fishermen. He fished with his father and his brother. And I wonder if Peter felt like fishing or even just being out on the water was where he felt like he could connect with God. Yeah, this makes sense because Peter had some pretty monumental moments with Jesus out on the water. One of the most well-known stories about Peter was when he stepped out of the boat and he tried to walk on water towards Jesus. If you don't know the stories, the disciples, they were out on the water, out on a boat, and Jesus wasn't with them. When all of a sudden from a distance, they see someone walking towards them, someone walking on water. And they were horrified. They were in shock. They were in terror. They thought, oh my goodness, it's a ghost. They didn't know what was happening. But then Jesus calls out and he says, take courage. It's I. Don't be afraid. It speaks to his personality, but Peter, he was maybe the only one with guts enough. Maybe the only one who was impulsive enough. Maybe the only one with enough faith at that time to say to Jesus, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come out to the water to you. And so Jesus says, well, come. And so sometimes we tell the story as if Peter got out onto the water and immediately he began to sink. But that's not what happened. You know what? Peter actually began to walk on water. Peter, listening to the invitation that Jesus gave him, and he said, come, steps out of the boat and starts walking on water. He's doing this miraculous thing, and he can't believe it. He's walking on water. But then what happens? He starts looking at the waves. He starts looking at his surroundings. He feels the wind, and he takes his eyes off Jesus. He looks at the wind and the waves, and he begins to sink. He begins to feel afraid. And then he calls out to Jesus. He says, help, save me. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't stand from afar and laugh at him. Jesus reached out his arm and he caught him. He saved him. This is one of those moments where after they got back in the boat, the disciples probably looked around at each other and said, yo, I think this really is the Son of God. There was something miraculous that just happened. It didn't just go over their heads. This was something miraculous that happened. Jesus, again and again and again, throughout the time that he spent with the disciples, he astonished them. He performed miracle after miracle. He did amazing things. He healed people who were deaf, who had never heard before in their life. He healed the blind. He raised people from the dead. He took people who were on the outskirts of society and he invited them in. He took people who nobody wanted anything to do with and he invited them into relationship with himself. This was the kind of God that they followed around for the entirety of Jesus' ministry on earth. So I think there was something about Jesus that they caught on to. I think they were able to see that Jesus was the real deal. It wasn't just the miracles that he performed that made them feel like, wow, there's something really special about this guy. I think they got to see him up close and personal, and they said, wow, this is like nobody else who I've ever met. There's something really special about Jesus. I really think that he must be the Son of God. You know, sometimes we have those kind of undeniable, that was for sure God type of moments in our life. Sometimes those things are not like a miracle that happens. Like maybe you didn't step out of a boat and start walking on water. But maybe some of those moments have happened during this week. Maybe you've had some of those moments where you're like, I can't explain it, but I can't explain it other than I think that was a move of God in my heart or a move of God in the life of the person around me. Maybe during worship at some point, you've felt a stirring in your soul like you haven't felt before. Maybe during your small group discussions, somebody's been talking about something and you really resonate with it. You're like, oh, I really feel that. I get that. That there's something that the Holy Spirit was stirring up within you. And that's something that you can look back on years from now and think, that was God. I can't explain it any other way than a move of God in my heart and in the hearts of the people around me. You know, I was asked to look at John 21 today, and we read that together just now. As you conclude your week here at camp, I'm glad that you're looking at John 21. It's one of my favorite passages in the Bible. I was excited about this because this is a story full of so much goodness. You know, it's a story full of love and redemption and forgiveness and purpose. And we're going to get there in just a minute, but I think the setup of this story is so important. It's like if you watch a mini-series. If you're following a show on Netflix, and it's like if we just go to chapter 21 and you don't have context around it, it's like just watching the final episode of an epic miniseries. Like what makes a miniseries so good is if you watch it from beginning to end, you get to see the story progress, right? You get to see the plot twist. You have that sense of like, oh, what's going to happen next? You get to see character development. And then when you watch the final episode, that's when everything comes together and you're like, oh, that was such a good story because you've been on a journey with them, right? So I don't have time to go into the entire biography of Peter here this afternoon, but I want to just give you a few snapshots. Some of you already know the story, so I'm just going to give you a little refresher, but I want to highlight a couple of moments in Peter's life to give you a deeper appreciation of what's about to happen in John 21. So let's start at the time when Jesus calls Peter to be a disciple. I want to read to you from Luke 5. If you want to follow along, I'm in Luke 5, verse 1. I'll read it to you, and I want to make sure that you catch a few key points here, but we're going to go quick so that we can go back to John 21. So Luke 5:1 says, one day, as Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, which was also called the Sea of Galilee. This will be important later. Jesus was standing by the lake of Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee. The people were crowding around him. There were a ton of people wanting to hear Jesus teach. They were listening to the word of God. And Jesus saw at the water's edge 2 boats left there by the fishermen who were washing their nets. Why had they left their boats to go wash the nets? Because they had been fishing and they were done, so they were washing their nets. He got into one of the boats, the one belonging to Simon Peter, and asked him to put out a little from shore. Then he sat down and taught the people from the boat. Why did Jesus do this? There were so many people on the land. The crowd was so big that Jesus felt like he was getting pushed out. There was no more room. He actually had to get into his friend's boat and teach them from the water. There were so many people that Jesus had to ask his friend for help and get into his boat. So Simon Peter, will you let me out onto the water a little so I can teach the people from here? When he had finished speaking, he said to Simon, put out into deep water and let down the nets for a catch. Peter, I'm done here. Let's you and I go out a little deeper into the water, and I want you to put your nets down again, even though you already washed up your nets and called it a day. Simon answered, Master, we've worked hard all night and haven't caught anything. But because you say so, I will let down the nets. Peter was probably annoyed because he probably wanted to go home. He was like, Jesus, we've been fishing all night. I know what I'm doing. I'm a fisherman. But if you say so, I'll let down the nets. When they had done so, they caught such a large number of fish that their nets began to break. So they signaled their partners in another boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so full that they began to sink. It was a miraculously abundant catch of fish. They had caught nothing all night. Jesus said, let down your nets, and all of a sudden a miraculous abundant catch of fish shows up. So when Simon Peter saw this, he fell at Jesus' knees and he says, go away from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. Peter recognized the greatness of God. He's in the presence of a miracle worker, and he falls to his knees and he says, I'm a sinner, get away from me, I'm not worthy of your presence. For he and all his companions were astonished at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, and Simon's partners. But this is what Jesus says in response to that. He says to Simon, don't be afraid. From now on, you will fish for people. So they pulled their boats up from shore, left everything, and followed him. Do you see the parallels here? Their nets were so overwhelmed with fish that they ran out of space, and Peter had to call his friends to come help him. There was an abundance of fish, just like there was an abundance of people who had come to listen to Jesus. The crowd was so large that Jesus had to step into the boat and ask his friend Peter to help him out. So many people, so many fish that Peter had to call his friends, come help me out. The number of fish is so abundant that I need you to come help me. See, Jesus is giving Peter a heck of an object lesson here. He's saying, see this? See all these fish? Well, remember all those people? I needed your help. You need some help right now catching all these fish. And what does Jesus say to Peter? He brings the object lesson to a close. He says, you are a fisherman, and you thought that your calling was just to fish for people. But I'm going to take you deeper. I'm going to give you new eyes to see. I'm going to give you deeper understanding, Peter. You're called for more. You're called to fish for people too. Jesus was calling him into a greater thing. During their time with Jesus, Jesus astonished the disciples over and over again. And sometimes they were so astonished by what Jesus had done that it put fear in their hearts. You know, Peter saw this abundant catch of fish. He saw this miracle happen, and he was afraid because, oh my goodness, who is this? But Jesus continually, if you look through the Gospels, Jesus is continually reassuring them, do not be afraid. Do not be afraid. Come, walk out to me, Peter. Don't be afraid. These were the same words that Jesus said to Peter when he tried to walk out on the water, right? He said, do not be afraid, and then he gave him an invitation. Peter says, away from me, Jesus, I'm a sinner. And Jesus says, do not be afraid. And he invited him into something. They saw Jesus from a distance, and they were shocked, they were scared, and he said, do not be afraid. And then he invited Peter to come towards him. He gave Peter an assignment. He pushed him into his calling. He gave him purpose, the honor of responsibility. He promoted him from fisher of fish to fisher of people. And so Peter and his companions left everything to follow Jesus. I was trying to figure out what was happening here during worship. I saw a group of guys come down and walk towards this door. And to be honest, at first I was like, oh, they're just coming up to stage because they want to worship right at the front. Nobody explained to me what happens here, but this is what I gather. I saw the symbolism there. When you walked over here, then I thought, oh, they're going to take a selfie by the door in the middle of worship. That's kind of weird, but... And then I saw him walk through the door. And then I heard people clap. And that's worthy of a clap right now. I think... Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that a decision was made. I think that there was a commitment made to walk into something new, right? And I love the symbolism there. It's paralleling what we see in the Bible here. Your friends came down with you as you decided to make that step to follow Jesus, or to commit your life to Jesus, or to make a step into something new, right? Your friends came with you, and they clapped for you. They cheered you on. Your friends were able to be Jesus to you. I'm looking out here. I don't know where you are. I can't see you, but I'm speaking to all of you. Some of you have made that decision. We just saw that brother do it right now, but many of you have made some sort of commitment, some sort of decision throughout this week. And I want you to picture these friends that were here. It's like Jesus cheering you on. The Bible talks about a cloud of witnesses, people who are cheering you on. People, your parents, youth leaders, people who have been investing in you have been cheering you on. There's something good going on right now, and there are people cheering you on into something greater. God has purpose for each of you, just like he had purpose for Peter. He has a calling that's unique to you, just as he had a calling for Peter. So Peter, as he walked with Jesus, became one of Jesus' best friends. Like, he left everything to follow Jesus. And he knew that Jesus was the real deal. So imagine the shame that Peter must have felt when he did the very thing that he swore that he'd never do. But Jesus knew that he was going to do and loved him anyway. Jesus predicted that Peter would deny him 3 times before the rooster crowed. And though Peter didn't really fully understand what that meant, he said, "No, Jesus, I'd never do that. I'd never deny you. I love you so much, Jesus. I left everything to follow you. I'm ready to go to prison with you. I'd even die for you, Jesus." Peter was so convinced that he was so loyal, so down for Jesus, that he would never deny him. But if you know the story, you know the night that Jesus was arrested before he was crucified. You know that Peter had tried to defend Jesus by cutting off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. Peter was still down for Jesus, but then when the fire got really hot and Jesus actually got arrested and taken away, Peter stood off at a distance. Peter stood outside the courtyard warming himself by the fire, a fire of coals. And just as Jesus had predicted, once, twice, and 3 times, when the people confronted him and said, "Hey, aren't you that guy? Weren't you with Jesus? Didn't I see you with him?" Once, twice, 3 times, Peter denies him. And he began to call down curses, and he yelled out, "I don't know the man." And immediately, a rooster crowed, just as Jesus had predicted. When Peter realized that he did the very thing that he swore he would never do, he went outside and he wept bitterly. Jesus went on to be beaten, mocked, crucified, dead, and buried, and he was abandoned by some of his closest friends. But I know you know that's not the end of the story, right? It's the last day of camp. You know that Jesus rose again from the grave on the 3rd day. He defeated death and sin, paid for the sin of all people, for everyone, always, all people forever, right? And yeah, that is the good news. That's the good news. Jesus proves once and for all that he is who he says he is, and he did what he said he was going to do. And that would have been enough. If Jesus had left it there and he establishes that he is God over all creation, and not even death could defeat him. If he came back and he proved once and for all that he's not only the King of the Jews, but the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, the name above every name, the Most High God, the creator of the universe, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, Jesus could have just come back from the grave and walked the earth for 40 days just to prove that he is who he said he was. He could have come back just to give a mic drop. And he could have come back and said, "I told you." But that's not the purpose. That wasn't the purpose that Jesus had to walk the earth for 40 more days. You know what he did? He came back to redeem. He came back to restore. He came back to reconcile. And then he came back to release responsibility to people like Peter. We're already almost at the end of the message here, and we're just now getting to John 21. But this right here, John 21, it's the main dish, and if you're a dessert person, it's the dessert too. It's not the appetizer. It's not the free bread. This right here is the whole point. This is what we've been trying to get to. John 21, Jesus shows up again on the scene. After Peter had denied him miserably 3 times, Peter had failed epically. After Jesus had been crucified, dead, and buried, but also resurrected, Jesus had already appeared to his disciples. And people were overjoyed when they saw him. But Peter was probably still feeling a certain type of way. Peter had some things that didn't feel quite resolved yet. He hadn't had the heart-to-heart with Jesus yet, but that's what's about to happen. Peter may have up to this point been thinking, yes, Jesus is alive. This is great news. He really is the Son of God. But he probably doesn't want anything to do with me. He told me to follow him, but then at his most crucial hour, I abandoned him. Jesus gave me the name Peter, which means the rock, and he said that the church was going to be built upon this rock, but I don't feel much like a rock that the church should be built upon. I feel like a rock that should be thrown. Who knows what Peter was thinking? But I bet he missed being with Jesus. I bet he wished he could have a do-over. So like my brother who would go out to the water, would go fishing when he was feeling down, when he didn't know what else to do, where else to go, Peter went fishing. He went back to what he knew how to do. And much like that time when Jesus got into his boat and told him to let down his net, Peter, with a few of the other disciples, he went out to fish all night. And when they went to go fish by themselves, they caught nothing. Their nets turned up empty. Now in John 21, starting in verse 4, it says, early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't know that it was him. This was the same place, the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Gennesaret. And Jesus calls out to them, friends, have you caught any fish? Jesus is kind of funny because he knew they didn't catch any fish. I feel like he was kind of teasing them. And then they answer back, they go, no. That's all they said. They said, no, there's no fish out here. And Jesus said, well, then throw down your net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. Does this sound familiar? When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. At this point, they got to be feeling some kind of deja vu, right? Like, I remember this. This feels familiar. And then the disciple who Jesus loved, this is John who's talking about himself, by the way. John says to Peter, it is the Lord. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and he jumped into the water. He started running towards Jesus, swimming towards Jesus. Even though the boat was only about 100 yards away, Peter couldn't wait. Peter wanted to go towards Jesus. He said, I'm going to be undignified. I'm going to be unabashed. I'm going to go towards Jesus, just like the time he told me to get out on the water and walk. But this time I'm just going to dive in, and I want to go towards Jesus. There's so many parallels here again. Remember that first time? Peter, when he realized who Jesus was, says, get away from me, Jesus. I'm a sinner. I'm not worthy to be in your presence. But this time around, Peter, knowing how much he had failed, remembered that Jesus had invited him to himself. So Peter ran towards Jesus. Peter said, I'm not going to lose my chance. I'm going to go towards Jesus. I know that there's an invitation there. I can feel it because he knew Jesus. Peter was remembering that last time, even though I confessed with my own mouth that I'm a sinner, Jesus had an invitation for me. He said, I'm going to take you from being a fisher of fish to a fisher of people. I've got something good in store for you, Peter. When the rest of the disciples got to shore, Jesus had breakfast ready for them, bread and fish over a fire of coals. This fire is described as a fire over coals or a charcoal fire. And it's said that these are the only 2 times that a charcoal fire is described in the scriptures. When's the last time we heard about a charcoal fire, a fire over coals? The time when Peter was warming himself by the fire. The last time he was warming himself by a fire over coals was when he denied Jesus. And Jesus asks him to sit down by a fire. He's setting the stage for him. In verse 15 it says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John. This is a serious conversation because he uses his long name, right? If he said to you, Daphne, son of Leonard. I got something really important to say to you right now, so listen up. Simon, son of John, do you love me? Do you love me more than these? And maybe Jesus was pointing out to Peter, do you love me than the life that you're living right now? Do you love me more than your lifestyle of fishing? Do you love me more than all the material things of the world? Simon Peter, do you love me more than these? And Simon says, you know that I love you. And then again, Jesus says, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he answered again, he says, you know that I love you, Lord. And Jesus says, take care of my sheep. And then the third time he said to him, do you love me? And the scriptures say that Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him this third time, do you love me? And the answer was always the same, yes. And the answer that Jesus gave back to him was also always the same. He said, well, then feed my sheep. The last time that Peter was asked this question, he says to Jesus, you know all things. You know that I love you. And then Jesus says, feed my sheep. Jesus goes on to say some other things too, but I want to pause here and I want to make this point, which I hope will really get impressed on your hearts. You know, I've always seen this parallel between the number of times that Jesus says, do you love me to Peter, and the number of times that Peter denied Jesus, right? And it felt to me almost like Jesus was pointing out, for every time that you denied me, I want you to tell me that you love me. It was almost like every time that he denied him had to be canceled out with an I love you. But that's not really how Jesus works. You know, Jesus wasn't pointing out the fact that what Peter was really aware of, that he denied him 3 times. Jesus wasn't trying to point him back to that to pour salt in his wounds. Jesus wasn't trying to tell Peter, remember those awful things that you did? The awful things that you said? What Peter said was true. He said to Jesus, Lord, you know all things. Peter didn't need to say this to Jesus 3 times in order to make it up to Jesus and to prove to Jesus that he really loved him. Peter needed to repeat this 3 times because he needed to know it. He needed to declare it, and he needed to be assured of it. With every time that Peter answers his question, Jesus isn't saying, now look back at how you failed. Remember that pain, and don't do it again. No, every time that Peter answers, Jesus, you know that I love you, Jesus points to Peter's future instead of the past. He says, do you love me? Yes, Jesus, I love you. Good, now go feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, I love you. Now go take care of my sheep. He had a higher calling for him. Just like the last time when he said, you thought you were fishing for fish. Now I'm going to tell you to go fish for people. He said, Peter, don't dwell on the shame of your past. Don't dwell on your failures in the past. I want you to know you are confessing with your own mouth right now that you love me. And because you love me, I have something greater for you. Go take care of my sheep. Feed my lambs. I'm pointing you to your future. Follow me. Come to me. Do not be afraid. Now, here's the part that people might want to skip over and not pay much attention to, especially when you're trying to leave on a high in the last session of camp, right? Jesus also told Peter, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said, follow me. Peter, you're going to die unto my glory. And Peter says, wait, what? Jesus, what? What about him? What about John? What's going to happen to him? And Jesus says to him, don't worry about him. We're talking about you right now. I'm having a conversation with you right now, Peter. Don't worry about what's going to happen to John. You must follow me. And the same way that Jesus didn't promise to Peter a life of cotton candy and unicorns and a nice, easy life from now on, he said, if you choose to follow me, I'm going to tell you life is going to get really hard. And I'm telling you that right now, too. It was a great week at camp for many of you. But as you go home, even after an amazing week like this one, things will get hard. If you live enough life, things will get really hard sometimes. So if you've committed yourself or recommitted yourself to a life of following Jesus, and you're determined to share this message that Jesus died for everyone, and you're going home on this camp high, and you're like, Jesus died for all, forever, and I'm so hyped to go and make an impact in the community around me, then good, yes, please go home with that kind of fire. That's what the purpose of this week was. We want to fan you into flame because I believe that God wants to do something really, really good in each and every one of you. But I want you to remember Peter as well. The self-proclaimed ride or die for Jesus disciple. The one who did some super amazing things also failed in some super epic ways. And Peter's life didn't look like John's. Jesus said, don't compare yourself to other people. Your calling is your calling. The life that God has for you is your life. But your job is to follow me. Your job is to confess again and again, I want Jesus more than anything else in this world. I love Jesus. He has a calling for me. I'm going to go to him and I'm going to follow him. Don't play the comparison game. You said it with your own mouth. I want to follow Jesus. And I hope that you know that life apart from Jesus is like a night of fishing when your nets turn up empty. So what I want you to do now, this is what Jesus is saying to each of you, I think. What I want you to do now is trust me. Through the ups and downs and the moments when it feels like all is lost, trust me, love me, follow me, take courage, don't be afraid. God is saying, I'm going to keep pointing you forward to what's ahead. Don't look back and live in shame and guilt, but look forward. Come to me, keep your eyes on me. When the wind and the waves come, keep your eyes on me so that you don't sink. Don't feel like all hope is lost when you fail. Come to me. There's an invitation always waiting for you. And I don't know you all. I haven't had the privilege of walking with you throughout this week at camp. But before I got here today, I've been praying for you all. I feel like youth camps or youth gatherings are always really special because this is when your hearts are receptive to God. I mean, it's not like you can't be old and be receptive to God either, but I really, really believe that some world-changing decisions are made at camps like this, in weeks like this, within youth groups like this. You all are the ones upon whom which God wants to build the church. There is something really, really important happening here. So I hope that you don't think that this was a waste of time, that this was just your parents' opportunity to get rid of you for a few days. I want you to know that there was something really special that happened this week, and I hope that you'll look back on it with goodness and fondness, and you'll remember that God is calling you to something good in the future. You know, I think that there are a lot of Peters in this group. I think there's a lot of Peters who are kind of extra sometimes, because I saw that during worship. I know that there's some of you who are kind of extra sometimes. But I know that there are people who are also sold out, unafraid to jump out into the water, jump up on stage. Some of you almost got hurt right here at the front of the stage. But some of you unabashedly said, I want to worship Jesus. And you're not bridled by fear or what other people are going to think of you. I hope that you carry on that Peter-like spirit. And I hope that you'll live a life worthy of the gospel, the way that Peter wanted to live. I hope that you'll hear Jesus cheering you on the way that he cheered Peter on. I hope that you hear Jesus telling you, don't look back and dwell on your mistakes. Look at me. Don't be afraid. Come to me. And again, I hope you know that you're not here by mistake. I hope that God will continue to give you ears to hear. I hope that you won't rely on hype moments like a last session at camp or a worship band in front of you. I hope that you can look into the Word and God will meet you there. I hope that you'll have a hunger that won't be satisfied anywhere outside of knowing Jesus. And I hope that you know that God wants to change the world through you, through people like you, just the way that he wanted to change the world through people like Peter. You're the future of the church. And Jesus is cheering you on.